if you look at any baseline statistics, the wealth disparity between the top 1% in America and the common citizenry is pretty darn obvious. But anytime you talk about this, usually you get some communist that is jumping the gun and saying, oh, no one should be rich, everyone should be equally miserable and starve to death, like throughout history. And I'm not a big fan of either of those things. So today we're going to talk about wealth inequality, what it is, how it comes about, how we fix it, and how not to do it. As in, how to correct any potential issues in society without accidentally killing 30 million people or whatever it happens to be. So, this all came about because a politician named Sam Cedar has come to my attention who advocates for returning to the previous tax system that we had, which was a 90% marginal tax rate for anyone making over $4 million a year. So basically, for every dollar over that $4 million that you take home every year, the government gets 90 cents out of every dollar that you make. Obviously, that's a huge step up, and it's all done from the perspective of, well, the wealth gap is an issue, we need to address it. And so the fastest way to do that is just to take away from the people that have and, Robin Hood it over to the people that don't. Problem solved. The issue is we have plenty of examples throughout history, but before we dive into the actual issues here, we're going to need to discuss some of the underlying foundations, why we care about equality, what wealth inequality even is, why it happens, and how this same phenomenon has been occurring throughout all of human history. It's not just a modern issue. So to start, why do we care about equality? I've talked about this in other pieces of content in the past, but before Christianity, the idea of equality was laughable. After Christianity, the idea of equality still is laughable. It started as human dignity, right? The idea that everyone is equal before God, which is a radical statement. You ask anyone in the ancient world, go back just because of how society was ordered. You have the divine right of kings, you have the mandate of heaven in Asia, things of that nature. There was just kind of this understanding that God favored some people over others, or whatever they understood to be the organizing principle of the universe. And some people are just higher up on the totem pole. You can see it very obviously still today in strict caste systems like India. But throughout all of history, we've had this established hierarchy, and it's just kind of been understood that, the people that are in charge are stronger, smarter, braver, so on and so forth. But at the very least, even if you had a ruler that you looked down on, which might have been the case as with some of the um, uh, less reputable bloodlines, let's say, in Europe with a bunch of, inbreeding and everything, the concept of human dignity and being equal before God, being held to the same account for, the good you do in your life, right and wrong, that was a radical idea. And even though it didn't translate to making a completely equal society, because you still have hierarchy, uh, introducing that concept radically shifted our understanding of the purpose of human beings. A lot of cases in the past, it was just, I'm in charge because I'm the biggest and the strongest, and all the rest of you have to do what I say or bad things happen to you. And people just kind of went with that because, that's life, and they didn't know anything different. Then we get to the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, which has the slogan, of course, of liberty, fraternity, equality. And that's really when we saw this idea of equality, of everyone being equal, really start to blossom and infect society. And that established equality not as being equal before God, having equal dignity, being held equally accountable for the good and evil you do in life, but the idea that there isn't hierarchy, that hierarchy is somehow on injustice or shouldn't exist, and then that as a consequence means that no one is greater or lesser than anyone else. Now, the impulse for justice combined with the value of equality has given us the modern sentiment that someone has been harmed if someone is higher than other people, that there's some sort of injustice or some kind of unfairness present if someone is recognized as being stronger or more capable or something along those lines. And that's a very dangerous belief to hold that any sort of success, usually in this context, we're talking about financial success, but even other areas, athletics, status, anything like that, it's very dangerous to hold the belief that to get to the top, it's inherently evil because you must have screwed somebody over. Because then that's going to mean that you, trying to be a decent person, are never going to do anything. And you're going to justify your lack of ambition and your lack of results with, well, if I get there, I'm a bad person, but I'm so noble right now because I haven't made anything in my life. If you look at that at an objective level, it's ridiculous, but a lot of people tend to live that way. Now, another important note before we get started here. This entire argument for equality being a good thing is predicated on the belief that there is an objective hierarchy. By asserting that everyone is equal and that it's unjust for inequalities to be present, you're making an appeal to an objective moral order, to a standard that's not just you. Because if you don't have any objectivity in the world, then there is no measurement that you can judge that your opinions are any better than mine, or vice versa. And so if I say, well, I don't believe that I don't believe that equality is important, and you say, well, no, equality is the most important thing in the world, we have no mechanism to actually resolve that argument, because there's nothing outside us that we can point to. And of course, you're going to think that your opinions are better than mine, and I'm going to think mine are better than yours, and so we're kind of at an impasse. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this topic, that anytime anyone is talking about equality, they're asserting that it is inherently good, which asserts a objective moral order. Even if most of them don't want to admit to it, their logic does not hold up whatsoever without that fundamental piece. First thing that we need to recognize here is that there is a very important distinction between what we'll call today, for our purposes, politics of ambition, politics of jealousy, and politics of envy. Politics, this being not in like political parties or what you think of today, but politics in the true sense, coming from the, I believe, Greek word polis, meaning city, which is, and really the word just describes how society regulates itself and governs interactions between people. So technically speaking, any interaction you have with another member of your society is politics. So keep that in mind. So politics of ambition says, I want that. You look around and you say, hey, that's cool. Hey, that's cool. Hey, that's cool. And that gives you an orientation, something you're going after, right? Something you're trying to become, something you're trying to get, whatever the case may be. Politics of ambition. Then we have the second one, which is politics of jealousy. And this says, I want what he has. You look next door at your neighbor's driveway and you see he has a Ferrari, and you're like, oh, that's neat. I would like to get a Ferrari. That's politics of jealousy. Notice, and this is often misunderstood. Usually we use the words jealousy and envy interchangeably, but that's not the case. We can see in the Bible, right, God is talked about as being jealous when people are giving undue attention to idols and constructions other than him. Right? God is a jealous God in the sense that he wants us to serve him first and place him first in our lives. But that's not destructive, right? Because that's due to him. But it's wanting what somebody has. It's not wishing them ill. Envy, on the other hand, politics of envy says it's wrong that he has that. You look over your neighbor's driveway and you say, hey, he has a Ferrari. I don't have a Ferrari. That's not fair. And you go over and you slash the tires and punch in the windows and everything like that. So you can see there's a very obvious when you think about it, but not on the surface, escalation, right? Ambition is just generally, here's what I want to be. Jealousy is something specific that you're aiming for that someone else has that isn't necessarily bad. Maybe someone else having something motivates you toward it. And then envy says, he's ahead of me. I need to tear him down to make this fair, to make this just. And the reason that this comes up, this framework appears so often when we see discussions of redistributing wealth or fixing the wealth gap or something along those lines, is because it's a lot easier to lower everyone to a lower state than it is to lift people at lower states higher up, right? This is a very obviously indicated in the public school system, right? It's kind of become a meme at this point, where all public education is built around the bottom quintile, which is to say the lowest 20% of students. Because in creating the slogan, No Child Left Behind, they realize, hey, it's really hard to get lazy or just unintelligent people to a higher standard. So instead, we're going to take the high performers and we're going to drag them down to the level of that bottom 20%, so that bottom 20% doesn't feel offended or mocked or anything like that for not measuring up to the same standard that a lot of their peers are. And you can see this echo throughout the rest of society. And the reason oftentimes that it's harder to lift people up than to drag everyone else down is because a lot of times the people at the bottom are there because they want to be, right? That old saying, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Everybody has a mountain of opportunities in their lives. They might not recognize a lot of them. And obviously, I'm not saying that people don't have struggles, because that's stupid. People have struggles of different levels, different intensities, different durations throughout their lives. But the fact of the matter is, like, if you're able to watch this video, you have a wealth of opportunity before you just through the internet, to say nothing about your connections, your place in society, people you knew at high school, college, whatever, right? Just through the internet, you have a wealth of opportunities before you that no one else in history has ever had before them, right? So being in that bottom 20%, some of it is, of course, attributable to things like IQ and other basically immutable characteristics that you can't really change. But a lot of it is also just drive. Like if you look at the most successful people in pretty much any area, athletics, business, whatever, the people that are at the top of the game are not the people that are the strongest and the smartest and had the best starting position. They're the people that said, hey, I've got a pretty crappy hand. Oh, well, I'm going to make it work. And they just refused to quit and they went after it. So the point being, people that are in that bottom 20% usually are there because they're content to stay there and they don't want to put themselves through the struggle and the uncertainty of changing and developing into a higher version of themselves, especially in the society that we have today where you're not going to immediately starve to death or whatever if you don't show up and perform. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. So no matter how many opportunities you give someone, they still have to choose to cooperate with that opportunity to actually make it become a reality and make something of themselves. It's not something where you can just hand somebody $10,000 and then, oh, suddenly their life just magically changes and they're a better person. We see this with lottery winners all the time. People win the lottery and then they'll walk away with millions of dollars even after they get half of it taken away by taxes. And then in a few years they're broke again because it had nothing to do with the material conditions of the person. It was everything to do with how they approach their life, the ambition, the self-control, and other things that are entirely an internal game. And no matter how much you give other people, you can't force them to take that step if they don't want to take it. Now, the next thing that we need to recognize in the wealth gap conversation is that to recognize any hierarchy or difference between people is to recognize an inequality, because equal means same. There's a difference, things aren't the same. And so, in our world centered on niceness and like, oh no, you're good enough, you can do anything you put your mind to, so on and so forth, we can't accept as a first principle or a reality the fact that some people are better than others. And again, this is not saying like more valuable in terms of human dignity, because we're all equal before God in that. But if you compare me to, I don't know, a competitive like power lifter, he's going to be way better at me than that, right? Any two people that you put in a room together, they're not going to be the same person. They're going to have strengths and weaknesses that overshadow the other person. And so in any given arena, any two people, there's going to be one who is superior and one who is inferior. We don't like to talk in those terms because we like equality, but that's just how the world is. Hierarchy is inevitable. Now, at this point, fortunately, I think our society is really getting over the participation award effect, and we're really getting back to wanting to be ambitious and excellent and make something of ourselves and prove ourselves. That's a whole different video. But this drive to just assert that no, everyone's equal and everyone's the same really, again, started with the Enlightenment with John Locke. He had this idea of the blank slate, the tabula rasa, I think is the Latin term for it, that basically says everything about us is a result of our environments and the conditions around us. We're born as blank slates with no underlying programming, no inclinations or biases, and then our environment kind of just tells us how to react. And as we have experiences, we get programmed, in effect, to behave a certain way throughout life. Now, this is obviously arguing that everything starts with an even playing field, and then whatever that, like that wealth inequality or any other kind of inequality, is just a result of our environment and circumstances. And so it's inherently unfair because, or unjust because some people have different experiences that put them ahead and others don't. Now, this idea, although it's pushed a lot in society, has been pretty soundly disproven. Now we know there's both the nature and the nurture debate, where just through genetics you have predispositions to a lot of things, some negative things like cancer or alcoholism or something like that. But then we also know that genetics are the greatest predictor of somebody's IQ. Studies are kind of inconclusive, but it's consistently found anywhere between 50 to 80% of somebody's IQ is determined just by their genetics, which you obviously have no control over. And it's also a tough reality for people to accept because you can't really change your IQ all that much throughout your life. You can do things to try to appear sharper or come off as more intelligent or more analytical or something like that. But the hand you get as far as IQ goes is pretty much the hand you get. Another example of this would be identical twins raised in different environments. We've had cases in the past where identical twins that have the exact same genetic makeup are raised in entirely different communities by different people, different family structures, everything. But then you reunite them after a certain number of years and you find they have very similar personalities, preferences, value systems, beliefs, things like that. And then there's a lot of other research that also suggests that just fundamental parts of the brain and how we're formed is kind of just an inherent wiring. And this is something a lot of other philosophers do argue, of course, is that we have an inherent desire to do good, for example. A lot of places we would call that the conscience, and other powers like this that are maybe not necessarily directly measurable, like personality, but we can see pretty clearly that there are similarities across different people and different groups. So all this is to say, again, hierarchy, aka differences, are going to exist between any two people no matter how hard you try to make them equal, because they're not going to be identical on every metric. Now, this is really important to talk about metrics here because it's, again, as we said earlier, super important to have objective standards. And to have an objective standard, you need to have a way to measure it, right? We have this gut reaction that, our feelings are like, well, it's not nice to say that someone is greater or lesser than another in a certain area. That's not polite. It's not nice. But that's just cold, hard facts. And it's a lie to pretend that everyone is equal when they clearly aren't. And therefore, it is a reduction of your human potential and your, to put it in pop psychology terms, your path to your self actualization if you adhere to that lie and try to convince yourself that no, everyone's equal and we're all really the same and it's just circumstance. No, everyone has agency, everyone has a different hand that they start with, and that's going to determine a lot of how their life goes. So we've established that politics of envy, which a lot of modern political leaders will basically call equality of outcome, is inherently a rejection of hierarchy, which is a basic principle of existence. You can't escape hierarchy. Your options are either you have a government that has the authority and the power to force the general public to behave a certain way, or you have anarchy. In the first case, right, we can see this pretty obviously with any number of communist regimes throughout history, starting with the French Revolution even. They argued that everyone was equal, but then they had no trouble amassing the power to send people off to the guillotine, if they happen to disagree. And then so no matter how you try to construct society, to have any sort of society at all, you are going to have some sort of hierarchy, some sort of establishment of who gets power, who doesn't, who's able to wield it, and who can't. Now, if you were to do that and truly have a completely equal society where no one has any position of precedence over anyone else, that's where you get anarchy. And the reason anarchy is a bad idea is really just a root, a derivation rather, of why libertarianism is not a serious ideology, which again is a whole video unto itself. But for now, just think about it this way. Everybody's equal. You're just off, you're living on your little farm, you're living your life. Everybody's equal. No one has power over anyone. Everything's hunky-dory, except people are flawed and pretty evil most of the time. And so, a few doors down, your neighbor, what's a good name? Your neighbor Nebuchadnezzar says, "Hey, I see you over there, and I want your stuff because there's nothing stopping you from getting it." So then he's going to go over next door to your other neighbor. We'll call him. I really should not be thinking this long about nonsensical names. We'll call him John. He goes over to John and he says, "Hey, let's team up and go beat him up and take his stuff." And there's no organizing principle. So in effect, by creating a society based on anarchy, you've just created the ground to have a tyrant rise up, somebody that has that will to power that is going to take it and not entertain your delusion that we can just all live in peace and be nice to each other if there isn't any government, because there will always be hierarchy. People are always going to establish that, even if you don't like it. Now, we have an inherent sense of injustice, seeing the opulence of the wealthiest members of society compared to the struggle of the average person. If you look that much at, kind of a lot of the high profile entrepreneurs, a lot of them will say, after you hit it, 10 million, maybe a little bit more than that, you pretty much have access to whatever you want to do with your life. And then anything past that is pretty much just, a scoreboard to track your progress, to see how you're doing in the game of business. So we will, imagine like the absolute decadence and the lavish life that somebody can have with, $10 million. And we look at somebody that's worth 100 million or 500 million or 3 billion or whatever it happens to be. And we're like, okay, that's just a ridiculous amount of money. And there are people over here in my community that are barely making ends meet. That doesn't seem fair. You're right, it's not fair. The question is it just? And a lot of people have this kind of gut reaction that says no. Now, everything that we've spoken about so far, again, assumes that the wealth is acquired morally, that there isn't any scamming going on, that there's not any dishonest conduct, that you're not hurting anybody with the things that you're doing, that you have actually, or the wealthy person in question has actually acquired his abundance by genuinely helping people and trying to provide value to society. Because ultimately, that's how all wealth is created. It's built by an exchange where, I value what the person is offering me more than I value the money it costs to get that. And they value the money that I'm giving them more than the service that they're giving me. And obviously there are, stressors and pressures and things like that. It's like, well, you shouldn't have to pay however much it is for insulin to treat diabetes, but that's what it is because that's a monopoly. Yep. Table that right now. I would consider that to be, establishing a monopoly to fall into the camp of an abusive system. So again, we're assuming that the person isn't screwing anybody over. They're not doing anything that's inherently evil or deliberately trying to hurt anybody just to benefit themselves, right? They're genuinely providing a valuable service or product to society, and society is saying, hey, I want that, and then freely trading with them to get that, right? And a really interesting phenomenon here that we can observe is wealth multiplies. So let's say I want to go build a house, and I hire the suppliers to get the materials. I hire some contractors to build the house, an electrician, a plumber to get it all set up and hooked up for me. Then I go in the house, right? I've paid all these people, the suppliers, everything, $200,000 to do that. Now they have that $200,000, but the house is also worth, at least $200,000. If you live in the right places in the country, it's going to probably go up in value pretty quickly. But the point being, using wealth, leveraging wealth produces more of it because it gives people the opportunity to participate in society, to trade for things that they perceive to be valuable. And we just use money as a stand-in for that. So it really makes trade more efficient. And if you have a free society that allows that sort of trade to take place, you're going to naturally generate more prosperity for your people as they create goods and services with inherent worth while receiving that baseline money at the same time. Hope that makes sense because I don't want to spend too much time on that. So the next thing we need to recognize is the difference between getting wealth immorally and using wealth for evil ends. We can see a lot of instances people get obscenely wealthy and then they decide that gives them a place of undue authority over the world or their fellow man, and they think that it allows them to disregard the dignity of other people because, well, I'm wealthy and I'm important, and so my life is more valuable than you, and kind of your cartoon supervillain. And I don't want to mischaracterize any positions here because I think that sort of view of good and evil is kind of reductionistic. I think most people, and this is pretty obvious, the most psychotic people in society are still going to regard themselves as good people. Actually, hold that thought. I need to find a book here. All right, so here we go. Dale Carnegie's famous book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. He opens by giving us the tale of the infamous two-gun Crowley, who is a gunman with a very sensationalized manhunt in 1931, hunted down by a bunch of police, shot a bunch of the police, was finally arrested. And after that point, he, well, let's see, I'll just read this. Without saying a word, Crowley drew his gun and cut the policeman down with a shower of lead. As the dying officer fell, Crowley leaped out of the car, grabbed the officer's revolver, and fired another bullet into the prostrate body. That was the killer who said, "Under my coat is a weary heart, but a kind one that would do nobody any harm." Crowley was sentenced to the electric chair. When he arrived at the death house in Sing Sing, did he say, "This is what I get for killing people"? No, he said, "This is what I get for defending myself." The point of this story is, Two-Gun Crowley didn't blame himself for anything. Is that an attitude unusual among criminals? If you think so, listen to this. I have spent the best years of my life giving people the lighter pleasures, helping them have a good time, and all I get is abuse, the existence of a hunted man. That's Al Capone speaking. Yes, America's most notorious public enemy, the most sinister gang leader who ever shot up Chicago. Capone didn't condemn himself. He actually regarded himself as a public benefactor. an unappreciated and misunderstood public benefactor. So the point being, a lot of the times people that get God complexes like George Soros genuinely believe they're doing the right thing. They just have a value hierarchy and an understanding of morality that we would think was totally depraved. So all that is to say, right, somebody can acquire wealth by providing a valid service to people, but then turn around and say, okay, well, this gives me the ability to, do whatever that's not actually in service to the common good or really helpful to their fellow man, but they think that because they're a special snowflake or just by virtue of the success that they have, that gives them some right to do those things. Now we need to understand justice as being just giving to everyone what they are owed, right? And of course, you have the interaction of justice and mercy, but at its core, right, justice is reciprocation, right? The world's a game of cause and effect. If somebody provides more value than you, they're going to receive more than you. So if we were to pretend you and I are old-timey farmers, and I go out and I plow my field for an hour, and I go, oh man, I'm tired, I'm going to go inside. And you plow your field all day from the crack of dawn to dusk when you can barely see, and then you go home and you sleep. I shouldn't be mad in several months' time when you get a much greater harvest than I do because you did way more work than I did, and in selling that grain or whatever you do with it, provide more value than I ever did with my measly hour of work. And so we shouldn't be surprised when the people that do significantly less get significantly less. And sometimes people in those situations of scarcity, of not really being able to get by, sometimes they deserve blame for that because they're sitting around all day playing video games. And if that sounds personal, I've done that before. Like this is not me throwing stones at anybody else. This is me kind of dunking on a past version of me. But the point being, like, if you don't want to work, you're not going to get the results of what work provides. Now, the next thing that we need to understand here is that private property is not an absolute right. And again, this is a very difficult statement to make because when you say it, communists are like, you're my guy, you're on my side. And you're like, no, I'm not a communist. No, stop. I'm a Catholic. Catholics are not allowed to be communists, okay? It's condemned by the church. It's very clear on that topic. And they're like, no, are you though? Are you though? And we could see, all the like think of the landlords memes and stuff like that, where we kind of just have, again, this inherent understanding that if someone has superabundance, they should be willing to supply that to help the people that are, more in need. So to that end, just so there are no misunderstandings here, I'm going to read directly from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, its statement on private property. If you're not a Catholic, I would challenge you just to listen to this quotation and then let me know in the comments if you want any clarification on anything, but more importantly, if you disagree with anything that is said here, because I think it's a very important topic. So without further ado, once I can find the appropriate page, for the record, one thing that's also worth noting, this section is underneath the category of the seventh commandment, right? Thou shalt not steal. So it's provided in that context. And this is what we would call the universal destination of goods. In the beginning, God entrusted the earth and its resources to the common stewardship of mankind to take care of them, master them by labor, and enjoy their fruits. The goods of creation are destined for the whole human race. However, the earth is divided up among men to assure the security of their lives, endangered by poverty and threatened by violence. The appropriation of property is legitimate for guaranteeing the freedom and dignity of persons and for helping each of them to meet his basic needs and the needs of those in his charge. It should allow for a natural solidarity to develop between men. The right to private property, acquired or received in a just way, does not do away with the original gift of the earth to the whole of mankind. The universal destination of goods remains primordial, even if the promotion of the common good requires respect for the right to private property and its exercise. In his use of things, man should regard the external goods he legitimately owns not merely as exclusive to himself, but common to others also in the sense that they can benefit others as well as himself. The ownership of any property makes its holder a steward of providence, with the task of making it fruitful and communicating its benefits to others, first of all his family. Goods of production, material or immaterial, such as land, factories, practical or artistic skills, oblige their possessors to employ them in ways that will benefit the greatest number. Those who hold goods for use and consumption should use them with moderation, reserving the better part for guests, the sick, and the poor. Political authority has the right and duty to regulate the legitimate exercise of the right to ownership for the sake of the common good. So that is the basic position on private property. Now, a lot of people might read that and again say, well, that sounds kind of communist. But when you think about it, it's not saying that private property is not important, not even close. What it's saying is that the world was given to all of humanity, originally Adam and Eve, but as a consequence, all of humanity for human good. And so, insofar as somebody does not have their basic needs met, they're not under any moral obligation to avoid meeting those needs. So this is, the classic example that we see, like like during the riots in 2020 or stuff, where it's like, oh, these are people that are just starving and trying to feed their families. They're getting arrested for stealing a loaf of bread when you see them walking out of Walmart with TVs and stuff and whatever. So there is certainly an appropriate use of private property, which this passage, I can pronounce words, says is the promotion of the common good, and that promotion of the common good requires respect for the right to private property and its exercise. We see it in a couple other places in the Gospels, right? Matthew chapter 20, Jesus is telling a parable. One of the things he says is, am I not free to do what I want with my own money? In Matthew chapter 13, you get the famous, parable of the talents. To him who has, more will be given. To him who has not, more will be taken away. So there's a very obvious hierarchy even established in the Bible, and Christ never denounces it as a bad thing. Now, why is accumulating wealth allowed? Like, if there is this universal destination of goods, if all the world is meant for the benefit of all people, then why do we have private property? Why do I have the right to own a car or a house or land or whatever and say, hey, you can't come here, this is mine? It's because that is the most basic incentive structure that we have had throughout all of human history, from the very earliest times, to do good in the world, right? Which is to say, your right to something, having produced it, is a benefit of what you do. And so a society that does not reward or even punishes producers will see a massive drop in their prosperity, because at the end of the day, we're wired to avoid doing things for which there is no benefit. So let's say I get a job. I walk in making, I don't know, 20 bucks an hour, right? My supervisor's like, well, you know what? Actually, we're not going to pay you today because actually that money is getting redistributed to all of America. I'm going to say, oh, so I'm not benefiting from working, spending 8 hours of my time here. And the boss is like, no, it's just, getting donated to everyone. You'll get like maybe a couple pennies, because that's what everyone else is getting. But yeah, anyway, here's your workstation. I'd be like, okay, I quit. See ya. And that's just a very basic example of the incentive structure there. We can see a couple more dramatic examples throughout history. The Soviet Union, right? Famously, they collectivized agriculture, and that created a massive drop in productivity because there was no reward for actually working hard and producing food, which led to mass starvation, the Holodomor, which of course was the genocide of millions of Ukrainians, or people of the Ukraine, I guess I should say, and led to a lot of black markets and things of that sort, because people had to figure out other ways to trade in order to survive. Another example from around the same period, Mao Zedong's famous Great Leap Forward in China, which was anything but, where he similarly collectivized agriculture, and that led to a famine that killed an estimated 30 to 45 million people, because it turns out that when you take away the incentive for somebody to do work, they don't want to work. Surprise, surprise. Now, a counterexample to this would be the Plymouth colony of Massachusetts, I believe. Pretty sure I know my American history. Regardless, not important right now. So Plymouth colonists, you might know them as the Pilgrims, roll on over on the Mayflower. They settle, they start their colony. It's a bitter winter. We know the whole story with Squanto rolling in and teaching them how to not starve to death and everything. There was a book that was written by an individual named William Bradford called Of Plymouth Plantation, where he just chronicled over 2 decades of the settlement's development, establishment, everything along those lines. And he chronicled how at the beginning they had a collective farming structure set up. And at the end of the day, they realized it wasn't working. So they had to they essentially said, okay, you know what? We're going to switch it to private industry. You get to keep whatever you grow or produce or hunt or whatever. You can trade with it. We're not going to just throw it all into a communal uh, cooking pot, so to speak, and give everyone equal amounts. So there are a couple of very interesting quotations here that I'm going to read off from his summary there. These first two quotations are from when they were doing the collectivized farming structure, and then the other two will be from afterward. Quote, "The experience that was had in its common course and condition, tried sundry years, and that amongst godly and sober men may well evince the vanity of that conceit of Plato's and other ancients applauded by some of later times, that the taking away of property and bringing in community into a commonwealth would make them happy and flourishing as if they were wiser than God. For this community, so far as it was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard, that means to slow down in ye olden times, and retard much employment that would have been to their benefit and comfort. For the young men that were most able and fit for labor and service did repine that they should spend their time and strength to work for other men's wives and children without any recompense." So basically, hey, why can't Tom work to feed his family? Why do I have to do that for him? And so nobody wanted to work. Now, after that point, we get entries such as these. "This had very good success, for it made all hands very industrious, so as much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means of the governor or any other could use, and saved him a great deal of trouble and gave far better content." Or perhaps content. I actually don't know which context that word is being used in. Second quote. "The woman now went willingly into the field, and took their little ones with them to set corn, which before would allege weakness and inability, whom to have compelled would have been thought great tyranny and oppression." Now, the funny thing is, this is a bunch of old-timey fancy language, but it's basically just a bigger version of you walking by the sink and saying, hey, there's dirty dishes. I'm going to be a productive member of this family and wash the dishes. So you go over, you're halfway through, you're scrubbing them down, you're feeling good about yourself. And then your mom yells down the stairs, hey, can you wash those dishes? And you're like, I don't want to do these anymore. It's the same principle, right? Uh, the latter of the two quotes, or the last two quotes, are saying when people were given an incentive and a direct benefit from being productive and being industrious, they worked harder. When they didn't have that incentive, they didn't want to do that because why bother? It's not worth it, as we've said before. So we need to recognize that private property, while in itself not absolute, is certainly a necessary component to have a functioning and productive society and produce good for anybody. And this is really important because anytime we get into this conversation, again, you get the communist sympathizers that are like, well, why don't we just abolish private property and be done with it? But at the end of the day, communism is condemned in part because of its abolition of private property, because it violates fundamental principles of human nature and human dignity, and in doing so causes great evils. Although, again, it's not condemned because of the effects of it, it's condemned because of the underlying assumptions it makes about reality and the assertions about human dignity and human nature that are just not accurate. So the earth was given to all men, and to that end, you can infringe on someone else's private property to meet basic needs, but that doesn't mean that you can take somebody's property to hedge against your own responsibility for your own life. So, for example, if we were to get on a plane together, we go out, plane goes down, we crash in some foreign country or, some state we're not familiar with or something, out in the mountains, and we're wandering, we find this apple orchard. Okay, that would be perfectly justified for us to, take food from that orchard to survive, because that's a situation that's completely beyond our control. Similarly, people can fall in hard times and they might need help. And out of Christian charity, we should be willing to extend that grace to them without really expecting much in return. But by the same token, if I'm just out on a hike or something and I get a little bit hungry, that doesn't mean that I can just randomly wander into somebody's apple orchard or like my neighbor's yard or something just to steal fruit because I feel like it. Right? There's a very clear difference there. So in one instance, it's an unavoidable, unforeseeable catastrophe that has happened that's forced us into a position of not having basic needs met. And on the other hand, it's just poor planning on my part or laziness or feeling of entitlement. And none of those are justifications for infringing on someone else's right to their own property. We see very clearly in 2 Thessalonians, St. Paul says, if anyone will not work, neither should he eat. Pretty cut and dry. And the reason that this is really important is because anytime you get into something akin to the wealth redistribution topic or anything like that, communists will say something like, well, it's a human right for this or a human right for that. Any assertion to a right is really it's a luxury ideology, right? They're based on human consciousness and our understanding of morality, not actual laws of nature. So we can see very clearly, no animal, no plant has has inherent rights. It lives and it reproduces and it dies, right? And sometimes it dies before it's able to replicate itself, right? You might have a sapling that's growing, and before it's able to drop any seeds or anything, it gets killed because other trees grow taller than it and crowd out the canopy, or an animal eats its leaves and kills it, or there's a drought, right? So nothing in nature has an inherent right to exist. It's constantly a struggle, and we need to take that into consideration because saying that somebody has a right to something does not magically make scarcity disappear. So the considerations of rights only really come into play when we have the luxury of, you know, conscious thinking minds that can actually reason through morality and figure out, hey, this is right, this is wrong, I have an obligation to other people, so on and so forth. But that those just don't exist as a fundamental reality in nature. Um, so a good example would be something like healthcare. That's something a lot of people will talk about. Healthcare is a human right. Really? Because up until, the past 50 to 100 years, we didn't have half of the things that we would consider healthcare today. Germ theory wasn't even developed until the last few centuries. Does that mean that the rights of anybody living in pre-industrial revolution or the medieval era or antiquity or anything like that, does that mean that their rights to food and shelter and things of that nature were infringed? No. The danger here is that anything that's a human right is inherently evil to withhold from anyone, which means it's inherently justified to go and use force to take it from somebody that has it and give it to somebody that does not, because it's in service of the common good, which is a higher good than the preservation of private property. The problem here is that if you aren't very careful with how you apply it in the limiting principle here, this very easily becomes a form of slavery, because what is slavery? The definition is the state of a person who is forced, usually under threat of violence, to labor for the profit of another, right? That's literally what you are doing if you are saying that something that somebody has produced is a right of somebody else. You are forcing them to labor without any benefit or repayment and just taking what they have and giving it to another person. And that denies a fundamental principle of reality, which is food, water, shelter. Those things don't just magically materialize in front of us when we think about them. Even things like food and water, which you can acquire from the rain or just growing a fruit tree outside, that still requires time. It still requires effort to gather it, to bring it to the person in need. And so to say that any of those things are a right means that other people have an obligation to help supply that thing without any repayment in return. And again, if you get rid of the incentives for productivity, then everything goes down because suddenly nobody has a reason to actually put in the effort. And then the overall standard of living and the quality of life of the entire society will drop because in trying to support the few people at the bottom, you've dragged everybody else down to that level and destroyed any reason for anyone to even want to be higher than that level in the first place. And of course, that's no way to have a functioning society. And another important footnote here is that food, as an example, can be justified to take, but that doesn't mean that someone is entitled to take ribeye steaks and caviar when they're able to access bread just as readily, right? I may have a right to food and shelter. That does not mean that I have the right to demand that I get the nicest house in the city and also only the finest food because that's my human right when I'm contributing absolutely nothing to justify receiving those things. Because again, at the end of the day, that's what money is. It's just the medium of exchange. It's how we value things. And so if I have a lot of money, if I've created a lot of value, then I can take that value and give it to another person in exchange for things that I want. But if I'm creating no value, I should have absolutely no expectation of being able to trade for the things that are rightfully earned by the people that have actually provided enough value and put in enough work to have those things. And human rights are framed just like Catholic social teaching in that they're not prescriptive. They provide general guidelines to say, hey, these are the principles you should live by. Those things are outside of the bounds, so those are unacceptable. An example would be communism. It's, again, inherently condemned because it makes assertions about reality and human existence and morality that just are not the case. And so the framework of human dignity and serving the common good can say, hey, that's unacceptable. But what it can't do is give a single order that's to be followed to the letter at all times, because times and conditions are going to change. It's the reason that there is no prescribed ideal form of government. In the West, we like to think that some form of democratic or Republican system is the best form of government. But if you look throughout history, right, the majority of societies have been governed by some form of monarchy in one way or another. And that's not because we just magically became enlightened all of a sudden. That's because times evolve, times change, and as they do, the principles that we observe to create cohesive societies are going to evolve and change and better fit certain circumstances and certain times as well. So these principles, they may be able to say generally that people have a right to food, water, and shelter, but it doesn't say that you must be able to supply every person in your society with bison jerky or you're violating their human rights. No, it's a general right to food. And if you are relying on the good graces of other people to receive your food, for example, that old saying, beggars can't be choosers, you shouldn't be picky. And if you don't like what you're getting, maybe try providing more value so that you have more options. And so this is where ideals meet human nature. We can't pretend that humans operate a certain way when all of history disagrees. It's abominably stupid to pretend that we are enlightened or built different or just stronger or smarter or better than our ancestors. They were people just like us with the same strengths, the same faults, the same tendencies to good and evil. And so if we try to craft a system that just assumes, well, yeah, this has never worked at a point in the past, but we're different, we're special, we're enlightened, we're greater than everyone who has come before. That is a great way to set your society up for failure, because if you look throughout history, every few generations we learn the same lessons over and over again because we are very short-sighted and pretty stupid creatures a lot of the times. And I'm not saying this as a kind of like, well, I'm a member of the intelligentsia and the Illuminati over here and I know so much more. No, it's just a fact of human existence. Much like how all the cells in your body work together to create the experience that you have, like all the cells in my hand are combined to make my hand. Similarly, human societies have all these individual people that come together to make a single uh, organism, a single entity, if you will. And then that, as that entity is renewed over and over again, they have to learn the same lessons because, you know, your ancestors will learn a lesson, but in 4 generations, you're like, oh, well, that was then, this is now, we're different. And so you make the same mistakes, and the world has to say, hey, that's not how this works. Time for a hard lesson. And so we just kind of repeat that cycle. But with considerations for human tendencies, we need to build a system that rewards doing good. Some will object to that, saying that, oh, you're super utilitarian or you're super selfish. But the fact of the matter is, everybody has limited resources, limited time, limited attention, limited energy. And so you need to craft a society where the people that allocate those things most effectively receive the most reward, because that's going to give people a reason to actually use those in the service of the common good and in service of their fellow man. And if you don't have a society set up with those incentives, then they're going to look around and say, well, why would I bother? It's not worth it, because like it or not, we are engineered as just a matter of survival to spend the least amount of energy doing whatever is needed to achieve a task. And so if way more energy is required to do something than we get out of it, we're not going to do it. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just self-preservation. That's one of the most basic instincts of pretty much any creature in existence, human, animal, plant, amoeba, you name it. People as a whole, as a society, will do good when there's an incentive to do so, and people as a whole will not do good when there is not an incentive to do good. Thomas Sowell has this wonderful quote: much confusion comes from judging economic policies by the goals they proclaim rather than the incentives that they create. A good example of this would be the welfare queens, right? We say, oh, well, of course we should take care of the people in society that are on hard times and aren't able to make ends meet. Of course we should be able to support them and help them get through it. But what that does as an unintended byproduct is it creates a lot of people that realize, hey, I don't ever have to do any real work. I don't have to apply myself. I don't have to become anything, because all my basic needs are going to be met by the government regardless. And that's really a tragedy when you think about it, because in pursuit of taking the path of least resistance, these people are dramatically reducing the person that they are, and as they waste their time, they're decreasing the amount of impact that they can have with their lives on the world, on their families, on their friends, on their communities, all because they don't have that fire lit under their ass that says, hey, I need to figure this out. I need to find a way to make ends meet. I need to find a way to provide value to other people so that I can get value in return and stay alive. So with all that groundwork, how do we actually equalize the wealth gap without becoming communists, without human rights abuses and becoming absolute monsters and just chopping down everybody greater than us in the name of envy and spite and a resentment of not being able to live up to that? Let's assume just take it as a given, there's a pool of money and resources that is generally owed to society as a whole. We have an obligation to support our fellow man, to provide food, water, shelter, things like that. Who has the authority to actually redistribute it? One of the things that's really funny when you get into these conversations is that whatever too much money is, regardless of what level you're at, whatever too much money is only ever levels above you. So you see this kind of on both sides of the aisle. Andy Frisella, and I'm not attacking Andy, I love him, but he's talked about how he's made millions upon millions of dollars, but he draws a very clear distinction between himself, who's an established businessman who built a company from zero, and the you know multi billionaires, like the absolute top of the heap, that are able to uh, straight up engineer societies and how the world operates with their resources. He draws a distinction. You can see with figures like Bernie Sanders, who famously was all about, no one should ever be a millionaire, and then he becomes a millionaire. Suddenly it's no one should ever be able to become a billionaire. That's too much money. So it's like, it's one of those things where wherever you are on the totem pole, anyone that wants to redistribute wealth is perfectly content with people having their level of prosperity and comfort. They just don't think people should be ahead of them, which again is politics of envy. And we want to avoid that at all costs. So the dirty secret of redistribution is that it will always find its way back to the top if there is a reward system in place. We can see this very obviously with the COVID stimulus checks, where people got, $600, $1,400, and not coincidentally, at the same time, the valuation of the world's largest companies and the wealth of the top 0.1% of society went up, because all that money, all that potential energy was given to the lower and the middle class. And because the people at the top knew how to make the money, it naturally funneled up to get them. Now, some people say that the solution for that, again, is to just take all that wealth and redistribute it. But if there's no incentive to actually provide any value, if people aren't allowed to keep any of the money that they make, then no one's going to have a big company, right? Nobody's going to put into work to do that, because it's hard, it sucks, and it's not going to produce enough benefit at the end of the day. So either you need to create an incentive and work within the understanding that there is some incentive, or there must be some incentive to make the people at the top rewarded for the efforts that they put in, or you create a society where the producers stop producing and just leave the country and go somewhere else potentially because they don't like the policies that are being enacted. And this is something that we see with the modern left, where they're the people that are simultaneously saying tax the rich and also protesting the Department of Government Efficiency, which at the time of recording is really heavily under fire for generally trying to cut out waste in the federal government. Like it or not, there's a very seemingly inherent clash there, right? If you think that the rich should pay their fair share and they aren't already, or whatever, you should also want to make sure that the money that's being taken from them is actually effectively reaching the people in need and being best leveraged to help members of society. But that's not the case. This idea of, you know, uh, equalizing it, and no one should be a millionaire, no one should be a billionaire, whatever, isn't about taking the money and using it in the best way possible. Again, it's just politics of envy. It's not saying, hey, it would be good if all of us had access to that stuff. It's saying, it's not fair that you have that. We're going to take it away from you, which is inherently destructive to society. And Beyond that, just destructive to the individuals holding it. As we've touched on, the basic needs that we have, food, water, shelter, are pretty much met by society today. We do have that welfare state. Now, as the Catechism says, right, political authority has a right and duty to regulate the legitimate exercise of the right to ownership for the sake of the common good. So it does have a right to intervene when the common good is upset. So, for example, let's say I become an uber billionaire and I decide to go on my Batman villain arc, and I go and I buy up the water rights to every spring and every aquifer and every water source in America. And then I decide I'm going to sell bottles of water for $1,000 a pop. The government will be rightly justified in coming in and saying, hey, you can't gouge an entire population for the water that they need to survive. That's unacceptable. That's perfectly justified. The issue is, again, when you get into that state of overreach, where suddenly it's not about serving the people in society, it's about tearing down the people at the top. Nietzsche wrote about governments, specifically democracies and more mob rule institutions, being a way to maintain the status quo and being inherently opposed uh, to exceptional people. The Ubermensch, right? The exceptional ones that he would consider. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. It's just kind of that idea. People don't like seeing other people get higher than them in a lot of cases because it reminds them that you could be more, you could be better. And instead of looking inward and saying, hey, why do I feel this way? How can I be better? It's, oh, okay, it's not good that they're there. Let's go get them. And the whole point of politics of envy is just about feeling virtuous and chopping down people above them. It's not about helping people. A good example would be the California homeless spending and how it still has a massive problem. And we also need to recognize that in the past, a lot of the social regulation was done by the church and by feelings of social obligation in addition to the state. But in a godless society, it's really just come down to the state. And so it's this tug of war between the wealthiest individuals who are seeking the most leverage in society and the government. And the problem is, if the government pushes too hard, then those individuals will just cut and run and go elsewhere. But again, the state can intervene when the common good is offended. Now, there's another principle in Catholic social teaching called the principle of subsidiarity. And what this says is basically the smallest group possible should take charge of dealing with a situation. So, for example, if I get a flat tire, I should handle that myself, or call a tow truck or something if for some reason I don't know how to switch a tire. But that's on me. I don't need to call my local representatives or my state government and say, hey, I have a flat tire, I need you to come bail me out. Similarly, if a local community is in a position to be able to deal with something like a homelessness issue or an education issue or something along those lines, higher authorities like state and federal governments have no business getting involved because they're further removed from the issue, and so they're probably going to be less effective at solving it. And so the instances where it becomes appropriate for something as broad as the federal government to get involved is in the case of something like foreign invasion or managing international trade, things of that nature that will actually affect the entire citizenry, as opposed to bearing down on just micromanaging and controlling this one aspect of individual citizens' lives. And this is for the sake of promoting human flourishing. And it's the reason that Mao and the Soviets ultimately failed is centralization doesn't work. The reason that the Soviet Union so routinely and almost in a meme-worthy way suffered from shortages was because it was a bunch of government planners saying, hey, I think that this area needs this much and this area needs that much, as opposed to just letting the market and the people that operated within it say, hey, I'm willing to pay this much for this box of nails or this crate of food or whatever the case may be. So in an ideal world, and again, we're not in an ideal world, but as an ideal, as something to strive for, problems should be handled by communities before it even reaches a government's awareness, right? With social obligations, promoting and rewarding generosity and productive behavior. Again, it's the example of doing the dishes. It feels a lot better to take the initiative and do something productive on your own time for your own sake, just because it feels like the right thing to do, as opposed to being told, hey, you have to go do this. Because suddenly now it's not anything done out of charity, it's a chore. Now, the world is not ideal, so sometimes the state, federal government must be involved, but it can only do so in the interest of protecting the common good of its citizenry. It can't just get involved because it feels like it, because that's a violation of the principle of subsidiarity. The state does not exist to punish its most productive members. This is a very important thing. If you have people that are providing jobs and providing value, again, in a moral and ethical way, that are doing those things, you should absolutely want to encourage them to give more back to their communities and help to buoy it up more, because a rising tide lifts all ships. And so if you have an incentive structure set up where people are rewarded for further investing into their communities, giving back, helping more people, you're going to create a better society. And it's going to be regulated more by individual goodwill and feelings of obligation and supporting your tribe, your friends locally, things of that nature, as opposed to the government coming in and saying, hey, we're going to take your tax dollars and go do this because we think we know best. Now, sometimes the best incentive that you can give is nothing. And this is very difficult for us to grasp in a world that comes from abundance, right? In a first world country where we have easy access to food, water, shelter, clothing, education, entertainment, pretty much anything we could ever want, transportation. Um, we don't really understand this. But as with the example earlier, sometimes the best thing that you can do is to not do anything for somebody. Because often, in the interest of being nice and having people like us and feeling like we're doing the right thing and feeling good about ourselves, we will do things that are actually destructive for people. So good examples of this would be US donations screwing up African economies. It's impossible for someone in an impoverished nation to get a business off the ground that makes shoes or clothing or something like that if the US is constantly just offloading a bunch of unwanted footwear and clothing and things like that for free into these nations, and we feel good about it because we're donating and our dollar's worth so much leverage over there, and isn't it a wonderful thing? But we're actually hamstringing those people, because we're why would the people in their communities want to pay them to provide a good or a service if they can just get the same thing for free? Again, it's the path of least resistance. It's what we're most inclined to do. Uh, and so sometimes, to be kind, to really serve somebody's best interest, the best thing to do is not to help them. Again, this is also the same for like the welfare queens. Maybe those people would be better served cutting back on what they're receiving for free for just sitting around and doing nothing, because and I actually not going to get into details. I know someone that is on welfare and refuses to get a full-time job because if this individual were to do that, they would lose their welfare benefits, which are comparable to, if not more, than what you would make working kind of an entry-level job, so to speak. That's a ridiculous and perverse incentive structure that should not be in place, but we allow people to do it because we want to feel nice. We want to feel like we're helping people, instead of giving people that motivation that says, hey, you need to, get your act together and actually figure out how to support yourself and your family and make something of yourself. So somebody being mad at you doesn't mean you're doing the wrong thing, and that's very hard for us to grasp. So in conclusion, income inequality is a function of the value that a person provides to society, and some people will always be more valuable than others because they're able to take on more risk, they're willing to put in more time, more effort, more focus, they're willing to just persevere longer than the average person does, and you should absolutely want to reward that. It is, of course, necessary to have a mechanism to punish those who exploit their fellow citizens or use wealth to harm them or to, in some other way, offend the common good. But in removing the ability to accumulate wealth, you give the producers of society no reason whatsoever to stick around, which we can obviously see in Europe today. People with resources don't just let other people mess with them, especially if they have the resources to push back. And worst case scenario, they'll just leave. They're going to follow what their incentives dictate, just like everyone else in society. So the way forward is for us to create a society that celebrates and rewards both excellence and generosity, because that's going to create the conditions for the most growth. That's going to give people the most reason and the most justification to put in the effort, the blood, sweat, the tears to make something of themselves and become a valuable asset to their community, whether it's as a business person, as an educator, as a clergy member, whatever it is, giving back to their community and receiving in return, whatever they value, that is going to make that sacrifice worth it. And the more benefit the wealthy get from giving back to society, the more that they are rewarded for taking their money and reinvesting it into their communities instead of sending it overseas. The more they are rewarded for taking a personal interest in raising their kids. And the more we socially value people that are present and active parents, instead of just outsourcing all that to daycares and things like that in the name of, well, preserving shareholder value, or whatever the meme is, the stronger society we're going to have. The goal is not to force them to do the dishes for us. It's to provide an incentive for them to naturally want to do so on their own, and not in a way that's going to trick them, but in a way that is genuinely good for society, and therefore good for our nation and humanity as a whole. Yeah, I mean, I hope that whole video made sense. This is a topic that's been on my mind for a really long time, so it was good to be able to just kind of crystallize my thoughts on it, get it all down on paper. Um, if you thought that something I said was brilliant or absolutely insane, please let me know down in the comments. I'm always interested to hear. Um, and learn from other people's perspectives and things of that nature. But it is really just a fascinating topic, because we're very eager to look for best case scenarios, right? We think that there's a single right option, and just like getting 100% on a math test, if we just figure it out, we can get it perfect. But at the end of the day, there are no perfect situations. There's only trade-offs. And so the question is, what trade-offs are we willing to make? Anyway, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up. There'll be more like it in the future. So feel free to subscribe if you like this um, hyper-fixated autistic rambling that I'm doing here uh, on Catholic social teaching, economic theory, and things of that sort. And then there will be another video for you to watch somewhere around here as dictated by the algorithm. But yeah, I will see you all in the near future, and thank you for watching.